Hi, this is week 4, and we conclude the first unit in History A04, where we construct the classic case of the emergence of capitalism. We started, you'll recall, by looking at the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Last week, we went in depth into an examination of merchant capital, looking at both long-distance trading networks in Europe, Asia, Africa. And then we had a case study. We looked very closely at Lynn, Massachusetts, and the transition from an artisan system of production to one that I called commercial capitalism. Today's lecture looks at the state and imperial expansion. And I'm sorry I can't be with you today to do this live. It's unavoidable that I'm going into the hospital on Tuesday for a procedure on my eyes, which hopefully will make things a little easier for me moving through the rest of the term. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is turn to the PowerPoint presentation, and I'll speak over some of the first few slides. We'll have some images as well. And there's a few video blasts later on in the lecture. Okay, the state and imperial expansion. Before beginning, I wanted to make my own contribution to capitalism in the news. You'll recall, of course, that last week we spent quite a bit of time talking about journeymen and apprentices and the old artisan system. Recently, there was a fascinating article and photo essay in the New York Times that looked at contemporary journeymen in Europe and how they've revived a number of medieval and early modern traditions. Here's some of the pictures from the article. You can see some pretty colorful costumes, some rituals. These are building trades workers. And I'll post this in Capitalism in the News, and you can read about the way in which modern day artisans who pride themselves in their skill, their hand labor, have revived some older traditions. I thought you'd find that interesting. But more to the point, what I really want to do today is talk about 3 waves of imperial expansion that, taken together, will help us understand a crucial stage in the historical evolution of capitalism as a world system. We'll first look at Portugal and Spain between the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century, the Dutch, who become a major power in the beginning of the 17th century, and then the French and the British. You might recall that last week, when we were talking about long-distance trade, the role of merchant capital, we called Europe a dynamic latecomer, at least compared to merchants in other regions, such as China in the Sung dynasty or Arabia. What I want to underscore now, before we get going, is the fact that Britain is a dynamic latecomer into the world of cross-Atlantic imperial expansion. We'll come to that a little later on. Excuse me. I also want to be really clear about the main argument this afternoon. What began as an effort to solve one of the crises of European feudalism, the need for monarchs, kings, to secure wealth for consumption and for war, became by the 18th century a dynamic new phase of emerging capitalism. There's a second part to this argument as well. The rise of racially based plantation slavery, which occurs largely in the 17th century, linked different parts of the global economy together in entirely new ways. So, over the next 30 or 40 minutes, as the lecture unfolds, I want you to keep this main argument in mind. Let's handle some other preliminaries first, before we get underway. Many of you, I hope most of you, remember in week 2 we introduced a key concept: historiography, the history of history, the way in which different generations have interpreted the past with fresh questions and different concerns. You'll also remember in week 2 that I said from time to time I would highlight certain key books in the history of capitalism and suggest that they would be good candidates for the book review assignment. Well, the first one of these pops up now. Much of today's lecture leans on a very important book by Robin Blackburn, a British historian, called The Making of New World Slavery, published in 1997. And I would suggest that this is an excellent candidate for the book review assignment. It looks at those different European nations, Spain and Portugal, the Dutch, the French, and the British, and fashions an argument about how each successive wave of plantation slavery built on the last. Now, I'll say this is not an easy book, but one that rewards reading, particularly if you're interested in slavery. The second book I want to introduce is by an anthropologist, Sidney Mintz, Sweetness and Power, The Place of Sugar in Modern History. This is a book that some of you will have come across in other classes, particularly classes in food studies. And this too would be a candidate for the book review assignment. As the title suggests, it focuses on sugar, not just the way in which sugar was grown on plantations, but the way sugar factored in to the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And third, I want to introduce you to a really remarkable book, Marcy Norton's Sacred Gifts, Profane Pleasures, A History of Tobacco and Chocolate in the Atlantic World. Norton looks at two crucial commodities, ones that were discovered and used in New World cultures, but then quickly picked up upon by the Spaniards, the French, later the British, and became a crucial commodity in the rise of the consumer culture in Europe. And this too would be an excellent book for review. Early European colonization of the New World began as a quest for gold and for silver. How do we explain this? Well, I want to suggest that there was a crisis in Europe. Let's start with feudal society on the eve of 1492, the year that's generally given as Europeans' discovery of the New World, Columbus's voyage. In late feudal society, as trade expanded, something that we've looked at as recently as last week, and the costs of warfare increased, feudal rulers couldn't squeeze enough wealth from peasants and from urban producers to satisfy their military needs, but also to satisfy their increasingly exotic, expensive tastes. Here, for instance, think back to our discussion of the spice trade. Think back to Professor Dan Bender's video blast that I shared with you a week ago. We've looked at things like peasant resistance. We've looked at things like the ecological and demographic factors that played into late feudalism. So, at the end of the 15th century then, many European rulers are looking for ways to grow their coffers, to expand the resources at their disposal. But there are obstacles, particularly obstacles in the East. If we think of the eastern end of the Mediterranean, where Venice and other Italian city-states had linked into the slave trade, we note that the Ottomans controlled Mediterranean trading routes, controlled essentially the gateway to the Middle East and to Asia beyond. Europeans began to think of new ways of reaching Asia, and actually Portugal was one of the first to begin exploring this, moving down the African coast. And 1497, 1498, Vasco da Gama rounds the Cape on his way to India. But also very important here is the role of Spain. And Columbus's voyage, in fact, and I think many of you know this, was an effort to find a more direct westerly route to India, where spices could be obtained. And between 1500 and 1650, Spain is actually the most important European power developing colonies in the New World. And most of these were focused on the extraction of precious metals from Central and South America. A staggering 180 tons of gold, 16,000 tons of silver removed from Central and South America and brought back to Spain. The most storied, and perhaps for our purposes, the most important Spanish entree into the New World was the conquistador Hernando Cortez, who in 1519 lands in what's now Mexico and begins to interact with the Aztecs. And here's a very stylized woodcut that depicts Cortez being welcomed by Montezuma, the Aztec ruler. The Aztecs later told missionaries in very explicit terms how hungry the Spanish were for precious metals, gold in particular. Listen to this account. When they were given these presents, the Spaniards burst into smiles. Their eyes shone with pleasure. They picked up the gold and they fingered it like monkeys. They seemed to be transported by joy, as if their hearts were illumined and made new. Indeed, the Indians recalled, their bodies swelled with greed, and their hunger was ravenous. They hungered like pigs for that gold. Now, Cortez himself explained this ravenous appetite in a way that clearly was manipulating his native hosts. He said, and I'm quoting, "We Spaniards suffer from a disease of the heart," he told them, "the specific remedy for which is gold." I want to suggest that for Spain and Portugal, this kind of exploration and this kind of economic relationship with Central and South America might be thought of as crown capitalism. This was a kind of economic activity that emerged directly out of the monarchy. This was not like the joint stock companies that Jeffrey Fulcher talked about in our reading for week one, when groups of merchants in civil society banded together and raised capital for trading. Crown capitalism was something that emerged right out of the royal courts, was highly militarized, and was state-controlled. One scholar, Pierre Vilar, has called crown capitalism, the experience of Spain and to a lesser extent Portugal and the Americas, he's called it the highest stage of feudalism. I think this is an important concept for us in History A04 because it harkens back to the feudal order that we looked at earlier. It was based on unfree labor, and here it's the unfree labor both of military soldiers, but more importantly, the enslaved native peoples of Central and South America. And secondly, and I think more importantly in this regard, it's based on expropriation. This is mineral wealth, gold, silver, other precious metals that are secured through coerced labor. And I want to turn to our first video blast today and introduce my colleague Jeffrey Pilcher. Many of you know Professor Pilcher, who is an expert on Mexican and Latin American history, but he also is a key figure in UTSC's Food Studies program.
Spain was the superpower of the 16th century, and not only did they conquer a vast empire in the Americas, but they also ruled much of Europe. To do that, though, they needed to fight constant wars, and that in turn meant they needed cash. And that's where the silver mines of South America became so crucial. Now, to obtain the silver, they needed to have a source of labor. And Spaniards, of course, were very happy to go as prospectors. And the great silver mountain of Potosi in present-day Bolivia quickly became a boom town, despite its very remote and inaccessible location, 16,000 feet above sea level. But of course, the Spaniards who arrived there did not want to do the work themselves. They wanted to have indigenous labor to actually do the difficult and hazardous work of mining. At first, they used a system called the encomienda, which was modeled on European feudalism. The idea that the Spanish lords would act as the guardians of the natives, and then the natives would in turn work for the protection that the Europeans provided. Unfortunately, the diseases that the Europeans brought with them decimated the Indians, and the overworking didn't help much either. And so quickly this source of labor ran short and had to be divided up in a more rational fashion. And so ultimately, the Spaniards relied on what was called the mita, which was the indigenous labor rotation used for communal purposes by the Inca Empire itself. And so every year, every community of Indians throughout Peru, the Viceroyalty of Peru, had to send a percentage of its male labor force to work in the silver mines to produce this for the Spaniards. And of course, nobody really wanted to go because the work was so hazardous and the altitude was so high. And so special courts were set up to administer the mita. And over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, Potosi produced an unbelievable amount of money. If we were to translate it into modern terms today, it would be literally trillions of dollars worth of silver. But all of that silver really did not make a lasting effect either on Peru, because it was shipped back to Spain, or even on Spain, because Charles V, the king, and then his heirs, spent the money as fast as it arrived. And so really it ended up in the coffers of the Fuggers, the bankers in Augsburg, who sort of managed the finances of the king, and really paid the troops who were fighting in the Netherlands, in Austria, in Italy, all over Europe. And of course, the money eventually, the silver eventually, is going to wind up all the way back in China. Where it's going to pay for the imports of Chinese goods. And so the kind of, in some ways, Peru and Potosi became a vital link in an emerging global circulation of capital it's really going to contribute to the origins of the modern economy that we have today.
There are several important points in Professor Pilcher's video blast that I want to emphasize before moving on. The first plays back to the way I set this up by referring to the historian Pierre Vilar's characterization of Spanish crown capitalism as the highest stage of feudalism. And Professor Pilcher talks about the two forms of unfree labor that Spaniards in Potosi used to coerce, to force labor out of a native population. The first, the encomienda, and then later what he calls the mita. The second key point I want to make is to simply point out that Potosi is in current day Bolivia, but at the time it was in what the Spaniards called the Viceroyalty of Peru. And here is a woodcut that depicts the rather remarkable conditions of this mountain of silver, 16,000 feet above sea level, that bonded native labor was forced to work on as miners. So it's a little confusing. It's in present-day Bolivia, But the area that the Spaniards called the Viceroyalty of Peru expanded over a great portion of South American geography. Now, the third point that I want to underscore is vitally important for us in History A04. Professor Pilcher ends his talk by talking about the way in which the vast mineral wealth being extracted from South America by the Spaniards actually didn't help the rulers solve their cash flow problem. They were spending money as fast as they could obtain it. And much of this went to fund warfare across Europe, both in terms of land armies but navies as well. Much of it wound up not in Spain, but in the bank vaults of a group called the Fugers, Low Country bankers who served as the financial managers of the Spanish Empire. And then Pilcher ends by pointing out that ultimately a good portion of this silver makes its way all the way across the globe, winding up in China. You'll recall from our discussion of the Silk Road that goods such as porcelain, tea, and silk are flowing from east to west. And in this way, what we're seeing is the emergence of a new kind of global capitalism, one that's beginning to extend its tentacles, its reach, across the Atlantic into the New World.